Will you pry these gifts from the unwilling?
Hey everyone, I'm Ian from Eurogamer. Now, when Mortal Shell first came out, I was just out of an intense Dark Souls and Bloodborne marathon, and I was looking for something new to fill that gap. Mortal Shell caught my eye immediately as it's visually similar and has some of the same basic elements, but when I actually played it, I found it super confusing and I could never really get into the flow of the combat, so I eventually gave up on it. Then I got my hands on the Enhanced Edition here and decided to give it another go. And after a fair few hours of struggling, the game finally clicked for me and I smashed my way through the rest of it with relative ease. What follows then is a tips video that will take all you beginners through everything I wish I knew before I started the game. These are tips and ways of thinking that made the brutal gameplay way easier to understand and therefore much less intimidating. So if you're thinking of trying out the game yourself, or you're just tired of having it hand you your ass every 60 seconds, this guide should make it easier for you to understand the underlying mechanics in Mortal Shell. Once you've completed the tutorial section of Mortal Shell, you'll emerge from an unnaturally twisted tunnel to find yourself in Fallgrim. For me, and I'm gonna guess for a lot of other new players, my first look at Fallgrim was quite intimidating. Everything is this murky shade of moss green. It looks like there are countless passages and pathways stretching off into the gloom, and it's quite overwhelming if you're brand new because, just like the Dark Souls games, there's no real signposting here to show you where to go. Also, there's no in-game map to help you memorise the layout of these tangled channels, and when every piece of scenery looks pretty much the same, aside from a couple of unique landmarks, it can be quite a challenge to form a map in your mind. Even after a fair few hours with the game, I found the layout of Fallgrim confusing, and I would often get lost, go the wrong way, and ultimately end up dying with no idea where I'd left my body. But while it is tempting, and to be fair, incredibly helpful to source a map from the internet, that is the way that spoilers lie. So I'd say hold off on that unless you really are at your wit's end. You see, after a while you'll come to realise that Fallgrim, while feeling like a twisted mess of mouldy spaghetti at first, is actually basically a big loop made out of lots of little passageways, and there are only 3 proper routes out of it, all of which lead to the 3 main dungeon areas which house the bosses that you'll need to defeat in order to finish the game. Everything you'll need to succeed in Mortal Shell can be found in this starting area, so getting to grips with the land of Fallgrim was my first step towards mastering the game, and once I'd learned the layout and gathered up all the goodies, the rest of the game felt way less imposing and was infinitely more manageable. With all that in mind, keep exploration to a minimum at the start of the game, because your first ports of call should be the resting place of Harris, the vassal, followed by Fallgrim Tower. The body of Harros is one of 4 unique shells in the game, so once you reach a fork in the road, go left and you'll be prompted to slip your weirdly smooth, Giga-esque body inside it. Each shell has slightly different attributes and skills to aid you in combat, and to understand this mechanic easier, you should think of each shell as a different class, with Harros being the most balanced of all. Once you've awoken Harros and climbed inside his body like it was some kind of corpse-shaped sleeping bag, you'll notice you have much more health than you did before. In your naked or foundling form as it's known, you'll pretty much die after 1 hit, so definitely make sure you find Harros before you venture any further into Fallgrim. More experienced players can give themselves a massive challenge by trying to complete the game without ever having awoken a shell, but absolutely screw doing that on your first playthrough unless you really hate yourself or something. The other 3 shells are spaced out around Fallgrim and will take a little bit of searching to find, but it's well worth making a beeline for the body of Solomon the Scholar, as his is the best shell for newcomers by far. His body is relatively easy to find too. It's right next to Fallgrim Tower in a little cave that's hidden by some vines behind the area where you have to fight a mini-boss named Grisha. You'll be pleased to know that you can just run straight past this hulking beast, as it won't be able to follow you through the tunnel to where Solomon's resting place is located, so you can save this very hard fight until you're a little bit more experienced. While Solomon's stamina bar isn't huge, he does have high durability and the largest amount of resolve in the game. Resolve is super important for pulling off all your weapon and parry abilities, but I'll go into more detail on those things later. Anyway, back to some more basic stuff. Fallgrim Tower is the imposing structure that you'll spot in the distance once you emerge from the area after you've found Harris's shell. It's extremely important that you go there as soon as possible, even though the game only gives you a couple of tiny indications that you should, because in this tower you'll find everything you need to level up your character and clues as to where to find the locations of the game's 3 remaining shells. There are multiple entrances to the tower, but the quickest and easiest way to reach it at the start of the game can be found by heading straight ahead and up this little hill. Fight your way past this group of low-level brigands, and once you've finished them off, up on your left you should soon spot a wooden door. Head through that and you'll come face to mask-wearing face with Sesta Janessa, who is basically the Dark Souls bonfire of Mortal Shell. Sesta Janessa never moves from this spot in Fallgrim, although she does appear in the boss dungeons. So if you want to level up at any point before you leave Fallgrim, you're going to need to return to this central hub to do so.
What a curiosity you are, wearing a mat like a shell.
Fallgrim Tower is also home to a couple of other very important NPCs and some items of interest, so take a bit of time exploring this location and familiarise yourself with the layout. Just across from Sesta Janessa you'll spot 4 candlelit recesses in the walls. These empty spaces hold the shadows of shells, which will appear when you get close to them, and by interacting with these shadows, you'll trigger cutscenes which will give you a little clue as to their physical locations. One floor up from these, you'll discover recesses in the wall for weapons you don't own yet, and a workbench for upgrading those weapons. Also, through a gap in the weapon wall, you'll find the Old Prisoner. This weird-looking giant thing is not only your main quest giver, but he'll also give you an incredibly important item called the Tarnished Seal, which will allow you to parry, and a healing infusion that will grant you a chunk of health after you perform a successful riposte. But again, more on that later.
That's better. Thank you.
Finally, up a winding staircase that's quite easy to miss, you'll find Vlas the Merchant. Vlas will sell you basic healing and buff items, and he also stocks a toolkit that will help you fix something important later on in the game. Plus, he has a cat that you can stroke, which, to be honest with you, is really the only reason you need to visit him in the first place. Okay, so onto your currency next. Your main currency in the game is called tar, which can be used to buy items from Vlas and can be put towards your upgrades from Sesta Janessa. If you're thinking along the lines of Dark Souls, tar is basically like souls, and you'll gain it from killing enemies or finding various lumps of it on dead bodies and in chests. To level up with Sesta Janessa, however, you're going to need more than just tar, and that's where the glimpses come in. Glimpses can be dropped by defeated strong enemies, or can be found in varying amounts inside chests or just hidden around the game world. These glimpses have something to do with the lost memories of the shells you inhabit, but the lore of Mortal Shell is a bit confusing at the best of times. So, to put it simply, just aim to get as many glimpses and as much tar as possible, and then, with a combination of these, you can unlock memories from the shell that you are wearing. Which is basically a fancy way of saying that you can unlock new abilities for that shell.
Fate is not ours to defy, only to fulfill.
Just like in Dark Souls, you store all of this currency on your body, and when you die, you'll lose all the tar that you've collected, although you will be able to reclaim it from your body if you can get back to it before you die again. You will keep your glimpses if you die though, so there's no need to worry about those, but your tar is super important, so you'll need to get that back ASAP if you lose it. Thankfully, the enemies in Fallgrim tend to stick to their set locations, so it is completely possible to just sprint back to your body without being followed by a huge pack of bads. You may need to do a couple of rolls here and there to avoid some wide swings from the larger enemies, but as long as you know where you're going, you shouldn't find it too hard to reclaim your tar with this method. Right, let's talk about combat and dying, because these are the two things that you'll be doing the most of in Mortal Shell. Get hit once in your foundling form and that's it, you are dead. But if you're wearing a shell, when you lose all your health, you'll be ejected from that like a crash test dummy that forgot to put on its seatbelt. At this point, you'll only have a couple of seconds to climb back into your shell before all the enemies wake up and go on a mission to cave your face in. So don't just rush back to your shell if it's surrounded by foes, as a lucky hit will send you straight back to Fallgrim Tower. If you do manage to climb back into your shell though, you can carry on again with full health, but you only get to do this once. The next time your shell reaches 0 health, that's it, you're dead and on your way to see Sesta Janessa. There are a few abilities and items you can earn later on in the game which will give you extra chances to retrieve your shell, but at the start of the game at least, you get but one chance and then you're screwed. So, how do you avoid getting dead in the first place? Well, that's the hard part, especially for newcomers and even those who are a dab hand at the Souls games, because although Mortal Shell might look similar, it has a completely different flow to its combat. The first trick to survival in Mortal Shell is to get hard. No, not like that. Oh god, no. The first trick to survival in Mortal Shell is learning how and when to harden. Yeah, that's better. The tutorial does a pretty good job of explaining this mechanic to you, but basically think of hardening as a block, but it's a block that needs to recharge between each use, so you can't keep spamming it. You can, however, use it in a variety of different ways, like blocking an incoming hit, or using it as kind of an invincibility shield to regain your stamina if you're running low. However, as soon as an enemy hits you when you're in a hardened state, your shell will shatter, and after a few frames of invincibility, you'll start taking damage again. Something I like to do is harden just as I do a heavy attack. That way, once my stone exterior has crumbled away, my foundling will immediately continue with that attack and stagger my attacker. Knowing when to harden and when not to comes with time, and different people use this technique in different ways, so don't be afraid to experiment with it to see what works best for you. Oh, and rolling also makes you harden for a few seconds, but without any cost to anything but your stamina. So if you're waiting for your main hardened power to cool down, make sure you keep dodging enemy attacks by rolling, and with any luck, you could avoid taking any damage altogether. When it comes to dealing damage to your attackers, however, you're going to need to keep an eye on 3 separate bars, including your health and your stamina. These act just like they do in Dark Souls, so if you lose your health, you die, and if you run out of stamina, your ability to attack or dodge is removed until you get your breath back. Just above those bars, you'll find a line of small bars that represent your resolve. You'll learn resolve as soon as you kill your first enemy, but you won't be able to do anything with it until after you've talked to the old prisoner and received that tarnished seal. Once you've earned a whole chunk of resolve, it can then be used to trigger something called an empowered riposte. Empowered ripostes use up one chunk of resolve at a time, but it's super worthwhile because if you pull them off correctly, you'll activate a special power, which in the case of the healing infusion that you grabbed from the old prisoner earlier, will award you a nice big chunk of health. It's also important to know that you can also perform parries without having any stores of resolve, but without the resolve you won't be able to perform an empowered riposte. The easiest ways to gain more resolve are to deal damage to enemies and bosses and to perform successful parries, but there are also some consumable items like moonshine that will fill resolve bars at the cost of a small piece of health. Another thing you'll be able to pick up after going through the ringer a bit is which of each enemy's attacks are parryable. If the tarnished seal on your back glows red and emits a sound, that means you're about to get hit by an unparryable attack, so it's wise to take a step back or harden up. Each enemy has its own unique set of moves, so if you memorise them, you should be able to hit a successful parry almost every time. This guy's fist pump is a great example. It caught me off guard loads at first, but once I learnt to parry after the pump and not during, I was able to farm health from these guys quite easily. Throughout the early portion of the game, you'll exclusively be using the hallowed sword as a weapon, but 3 different weapons can be found at the entrances to each of the boss dungeons. You can earn these weapons by defeating Hadron, the boss you fought in the tutorial, and he will attack you with the specific weapon that you're trying to unlock. By touching an old book which you'll find on a lectern next to a statue holding that area's weapon, you'll be transported to a misty battleground, and here all you'll need to do is kill Hadron to unlock that weapon. Once you've unlocked a new weapon, you can find upgrades for it hidden somewhere in that following dungeon. But you'll need to remember to use a workbench to actually add those upgrades to your weapon after you've found them. The easiest upgrade to find though is for the hallowed sword, and this upgrade, called the mechanical spike, can be found in a chest in Fallgrim, right next to the tower in that Grisha mini-boss arena. Grisha is an incredibly tough opponent, especially for beginners, but it is possible to run right in, kite him away from the chest, run back to the chest, schnaffle the goods, and then run back out without even having to fight him, just like you might have done when grabbing Solomon's Shell. Once you've equipped a weapon power-up, you'll need to use 2 chunks of resolve to activate it, but this will launch a devastatingly powerful attack that deals huge amounts of damage and will one-shot most standard enemies. Not only this, but triggering a special attack will also grant you immunity to damage while you perform it, so it's a great way to protect yourself from strong attacks if your hardened power is still on cooldown, whilst also dealing a considerable amount of damage at the same time. Consumable items also work a little bit differently in Mortal Shell to Dark Souls, and you won't know what each item does until you actually use it. Once you do use it, you'll build up familiarity with that item until you reach the maximum amount. Once you've done that, you'll unlock a boost to that item, so you might earn things like an increased amount of tar or a way to heal at a faster rate. Health, by the way, can be easily regained by finding and eating red weltcap mushrooms. These always spawn in the same location, but once picked, you'll have to wait for a while before they grow again. Memorising the locations of these weltcaps and the poison resistance granting tar spores will help you greatly in your first few hours, but never turn your nose up at a roasted rat or 2 because those things are way better for healing. Don't worry about these weird merman chests, by the way. They stay firmly shut until later in the game, and if you still don't know what you're doing at that point, well, I'm not sure how you got there in the first place. Now, my final tip in this video is more of a fun one than a functional one, and it revolves around the loot. This crappy little guitar only has a handful of uses, and one of those is to lure enemies towards you. This can be a great technique for luring enemies into bear traps or just aggroing certain enemies over others, but it also does leave you a bit vulnerable while you put that loot away and stand back up, so watch your back and don't get crowded. If you fancy a change of costume, by the way, you can always whip your loot out in front of Gorf here and give it a strum. If you do, he'll be so chuffed with his private concert that he'll burp acid all over you, and this will change the shade of your shell. Oh, suits you, sir. Oh, and don't forget to have a quick play of the loot next to Sesta Janessa too. If you do, she'll have a nice little dance to the tune you play. This does absolutely nothing for your character, but in a manky world like Fallgrim, it's just nice to spread a little bit of joy wherever you can. Okay, that is me done. Hopefully these tips will help you as you make your first steps into Fallgrim. If they do give this video a like, subscribe for daily videos about video games from Eurogamer, and perhaps check out some of these other tips videos that are on screen for you to click on right now. Right, I'm off to start my New Game Plus playthrough, so I'll see all you foundlings on the other side. Goodbye and good glimpsing.